All right, thank you, Ken. Appreciate it. As Ken mentioned, my name is Barry Levine, and today's presentation covers auto executive John DeLorean, a brilliant meteor that crashed and burned. I'd like to thank the Livonia Library for hosting me. I've written 2 books, one about Yankee Air Museum where I volunteered on Belleville, and Michigan Aviation, as Ken noted. I also do some freelance writing for the Historic Society of Michigan and HistoryNet LLC. For the record, in high school I drove my mom's 1968 Plymouth Valiant. That car was not a speed machine, so DeLorean is a welcome contrast. Road and Track magazine, in a 2014 article, wrote about DeLorean, described him as the inventor of the GTO, father of the DeLorean, lover, huckster, genius. And I'll be sharing his story today. Thanks are owed to many, as you can see on the screen. This photo shows Debbie Reynolds at the wheel of a GTO with John DeLorean as a passenger. For some overall perspective on driving, consider David E. Davis, who's one of the great automotive journalists of all time. He at one point wrote, "Will a fast drive on an open road in an open car lift your heart and light your dreams? Of course it will. Open cars remind us that the people who designed, built, and drove them were heroes." And as we'll see, DeLorean was much more, both good and bad, than just the GTO. DeLorean was from Detroit, was born in 1925. His father, Zachary, had various factory jobs, but had issues dealing with alcohol and anger management. His mom was named Catherine, and she worked in jobs such as tool assembly. Parents had a difficult relationship. Catherine would take John and his siblings out to California for a while, and they'd come back, and then finally the parents called it quits and got divorced in 1942. DeLorean tinkered with cars from an early age, attending Detroit's Cass Tech High School, which is on the left, and the Lawrence Institute of Technology, which at one point was located in Highland Park, on a music scholarship. He was in the Army, serving stateside in World War II. After the war, he had jobs such as selling insurance. He worked in a Chrysler assembly plant, moonlit as a saxophone player and as a dance band director. Went back to school and ended up with his first engineering job at Chrysler in 1952. By the mid-50s, he was head of research and development at Detroit's Packard Motors, and you can see the old factory here, which is largely torn down now. Packard then merged with Studebaker, based in South Bend, Indiana. DeLorean had no desire to move to South Bend, and he knew Studebaker was in financial trouble, so he looked elsewhere. And in September of '56, he was hired at Pontiac. GM recognized his talents and named him head of advanced engineering a year later, and he soon became chief engineer. For a bit of history on Pontiac, that will provide some context. In the 19th century, the Pontiac Buggy Company was formed, and that became the Oakland Motor Car Company, and that in turn was acquired by General Motors in 1909. In 1926, Oakland introduced Pontiac cars, which were very popular, and you can see one here. Oaklands were discontinued as a model in 1931. The assembly plant, Pontiac Assembly, was built in 1927 between Baldwin and Joslin Avenue in Pontiac. Built it out to almost 4 million square feet of space, and a wide range of vehicles were produced over time. This is the assembly line in 1939. During the war, as was the entire domestic car industry, the plant produced armaments such as anti-aircraft cannon and aerial torpedoes, earned several Army-Navy Excellence Awards. It went back to building cars in the 50s, but by the middle of the decade, sales were poor. This is a 1954 Pontiac. Looks okay, but to me at least, it's nothing special. By 1955, the brand was 6th in overall sales, long before imports like Toyota and Honda showed up, and well behind Chevrolet and Ford. In DeLorean's view, previous management was old, its products were dull, and therefore not accepted by the public, and there were rumors that Pontiac would either be closed or merged with another GM division. Change was needed and was on the way. At any company, no one operates in a vacuum, and that's certainly true for John DeLorean. His success was helped by many people, and we'll see some of them here tonight. The right set of economic circumstances, some brilliant marketing, and the men and women on the assembly line. Pontiac Division President Bunky Knudsen wanted to attract younger customers. His father was Bill Knudsen, a legend at Ford, GM, and as a World War II production czar. Young Bunky at one point went to his dad and said, "Can I have a car?" His father says, "Sure." And he brings home a trailer load of car parts. "You want a car? Assemble it." And young Bunky did exactly that, and the car was his. Knudsen then went on to hire Pete Estes from Oldsmobile as the chief engineer. He had worked in high-performance engines at Olds, so a perfect fit of what Pontiac became. Everybody's assignment was to create high-performance versions of Pontiac's existing models. As an engineer on the move, DeLorean was a key part of the story. In the early 60s, wide-track Pontiacs were the result with a rear new suspension, a wider distance between wheels on the same axle, and the vehicle was lower to the ground. This illustration is one of a series of artwork produced by a guy named Art Fitzpatrick, who drew the cars, and Van Kaufman, who drew the people in backgrounds. Some outstanding advertising work. The car looks better than it does in reality. It's a little lower and it's a little wider, but to me it's a great series of ads that those guys did. Pontiac's newfound performance image led to a dramatic rise in sales, and they reached third place in the industry by 1961. The city of Pontiac renamed the street Wide Track Avenue in the early 60s, recognizing the added jobs and economic benefits from what was going on at the car company. Meanwhile, while the designs were getting better, muscle cars emerged and the two would meet in the 60s. Muscle cars went back to prohibition in the 1920s when bootleggers would soup up cars with modified engines to rev up performance to escape the police, like you see on the left. Many consider the first production American muscle car to be the 1949 Oldsmobile Rocket 1988 that you see on the right. Light car bodies with powerful engines. Another factor was societal affluence. Historian David Halberstam wrote in 1964 that year was the high water mark of the American century, when the country was rich and in the middle class, even the young had money. Perfect time for the GTO and muscle cars, American-made, reasonably priced, mid-sized cars with big engines. Some senior management at GM wasn't so sure about jazzed-up Pontiacs. There was a lot of concern in the auto industry as a whole in the late 50s and early 60s about car manufacturers supporting auto racing. There was a mindset, race on Sunday, sell on Monday, but there was a lot of concern about upcoming government regulations. GM chairman and CEO at the time, Fred Donner, banned GM's participation in racing in 1963. You can see this hot rod Pontiac here on the screen. So the thought became, why not move high-performance cars to customers and let them have at it on the streets? Meanwhile, DeLorean was at work. As chief engineer, he hosted what-if sessions at GM's Milford Proving Grounds on Saturday mornings. Two key people were engineers Bill Collins and Russ Gee. They're both on the far right in these two pictures. Gee's on the top and Collins is at the bottom, and you can see a younger DeLorean in the bottom picture. They went on to replace the 326 cubic inch engine, which was available in Tempest Le Mans, with a 389 cubic inch engine to increase the car's performance. You can see one here. 389 put out 325 horsepower, a big increase compared to most cars of the era. Same engine mounts were used in different sized Pontiacs, so the larger engine didn't require a lot of re-engineering. So DeLorean takes one of these 389s out on the test track, describes the speed and power as electrifying, and GTOs were on their way. Here's a 64 GTO. To me, at least, that is a fabulous looking vehicle. By the mid-60s, Pete Estes was Pontiac's president and a big GTO supporter. He lobbied a somewhat reluctant GM senior management as some risk to his career to support GTOs. GM's bureaucracy was a problem. Engineering rules prohibited engines of this size in smaller cars due to safety concerns. One exception, the golden child, the Corvette. That was untouchable. So DeLorean goes ahead and reviews corporate policies which did not have this ban for option packages on existing cars. So the workaround became, for an additional $295 on a base car that costs about $2,500, you could get a Tempest Le Mans with a GTO option, including a dual exhaust and a Hurst shifter. Production begins in October '63. DeLorean adopted from Ferrari, and this is Enzo Ferrari right here, the GTO name as an acronym for Gran Turismo Omologato, a touring car sanctioned for racing competition. Ferrari sold very few of their GTOs and never secured the legal rights to the name, so off you go. Suitably named. The 64 GTOs had this 389, a stiffer suspension, 3-speed manual, bigger tires, and various dress-up pieces. Key figure in the story is admin Jim Wangers, who you can see here. He's seen by many as the GTO's godfather and one of the great auto marketers of all time. In 1958, Wengers began working on Pontiac's account at ad agency McManus, John and Adams. Wengers gave the muscle car era a jump start when in fall of '63, he sold Car and Driver's editor David Davis on a GTO versus Ferrari racing comparison. That led to this car cover on Car and Driver, probably one of the most important Car and Driver covers ever, suggesting that the two cars were equal, Pontiac GTO and the Ferrari product. Absolutely priceless advertising. But behind the scenes, a little skullduggery was going on. Wengers arranged to swap the 389 for an even bigger 421 cubic inch engine and upgraded the transmission and gearing. Swap fooled everybody, including Car and Driver. Truth wasn't known until Wengers wrote his memoir in 1998. Wengers further did a little underhanded work. He equipped the car with options like power steering so it would look like a car fresh off the dealer lot. Car and Driver's editors made stopwatch times acceleration runs. Results were incredible. We're going to try out 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds. Too good to be true for a production car. If you go out to my Ford Escape and took it out 0 to 60, it would take longer than 4.6 seconds, be assured. Wengers didn't say a word, and there was never an actual race between the Ferrari and a Pontiac, which was a shame if it had happened. Pontiac kept a low profile on GTOs in the early days, advertising only in publications for auto enthusiasts. Initially, there were no extra charges from auto insurers. This would change. Wengers saw DeLorean as a consummate marketer. He understood trends, what people would be looking for, and was able to deliver the right product at the right time. A sample of the advertisements. You might remember, if you're a kid like I was back in the 60s, actress Barbara Feldon, who was the co-star of Get Smart as Agent 99, here she is pitching Pontiacs. Cars were placed suitably in shows like I Dream of Jeannie, here with Larry Hagman and Barbara Eden. Another great product placement in My Three Sons, seen here with William Demarest and Don Grady. A sharp 1968 ad that appeals to younger buyers. And then we had this billboard on Woodward Avenue, which was thought to promote drag racing. After complaints from local communities, GM removed the sign. And you can see by the arrow, if you can see in the print, the great one by Pontiac. You know how the rest of the story, so clearly it's not promoting a sedate Sunday drive by grandma. It's a little more hot rod than that. Here at home, there was racing on Woodward Avenue, which was generally known as Woodwarding, from 10 Mile to Square Lake Road in Oakland County. I just have a sip. Woodward's 8 lanes were ideal for cruising, with plenty of fast food restaurants and cheap motel rooms at $10 a night, no questions asked. The posted speed limit never topped 55 miles an hour, but you'd have hot rodders and local engineers testing their vehicles at night all the time. I've been unable to find one way or the other if John DeLorean actually took out one of the cars and drag raced it up and down Woodward. I'd like to think he did, but I couldn't prove it to you, so who knows. Oops. Well-known Woodward establishments include the Totem Pole, which you can see a drawing of this in the background, and the blue GTO up front. It's painted by a guy named Bruce Kaiser, who had a lifelong love of auto racing and turned that into artwork. Kaiser has a whole series of art prints. They're fabulous looking. An unexpected assist came from Tennessee high schooler John Wilkin, who wrote the lyrics to the pop hit GTO. Wilkin was bored in class one day and drafted the lyrics. As luck would have it, John Wilkin's mother was in Nashville's music business and arranged for a recording with session musicians. Group became Ronnie and the Daytonas. That song reached number 4 in record sales in late 1964 with these lyrics: "I will spare you my singing. Little GTO, you're really looking fine. 3 deuces and a 4-speed and a 389. The 3 deuces are 3 2-barrel carburetors, and Pontiac distributed thousands of records to Pontiac dealers throughout the country to give away to customers." GTO sales were hot. Some in Pontiac expected weak sales, but in less than 30 days, they had orders for 15,000 cars with a GTO option, way ahead of the initial estimate of 5,000 sales. They sold 84,000 cars by 1966 when the model officially became the GTO, and sold over 500,000 cars during its production run. Current driver went on to write, Pontiac, God love him, came out with the best American car we have ever driven and one of the 5 or 6 best in the world for the enthusiast driver. And you can see John DeLorean here essentially riding the wave. So these cars were hot, and $500,000 for a car model isn't that much. Like Mustangs, over a much longer period, they probably sold 10 million cars. But as we will see later tonight, the impact was huge from GTOs. Whatever the vehicle, the cars didn't appear by magic. The men and women of the UAW got these cars built, both in Pontiac, Michigan, and other US plants and overseas plants. Could not find any reference at all about DeLorean's relations with the UAW and the people on the line. So I don't know if good, bad, if he didn't give it a thought, I don't know. Back in the day, the plants weren't air conditioned, OSHA didn't exist, so it's physically demanding, exhausting work. Very loud, I'm sure there are injuries and accidents from time to time. This photo is an undated photograph by a guy named Russell Marshall showing the late shift arriving at Pontiac Assembly. Marshall had a great body of work as an auto industry photographer. I think he did all his work in black and white. I've seen maybe 70 or 80 shots, and they really captured the mood, just how hard, difficult, and demanding this sort of work was. An oral history of life at Pontiac was told by line worker Carl Papke. This drawing of him was from later in his life. Papke's recollection starting at Pontiac Assembly building GTOs. In the early 60s, his starting wage was $2.73 an hour. Moved to Pontiac, he had grown up in the Thumb and stayed in a boarding house. Paid $7 a week for room and board, and they would walk to the local McDonald's, the only one in Pontiac at the time, for dinner. 73 cents a night, he would get 2 hamburgers, a chocolate shake, and an order of French fries, and that would be dinner. That modest lifestyle, he saved $75 a week, which went towards a down payment of a new GTO for him. Here's a couple guys on the line. Maximum production level was 80 cars an hour. So you're staying there, 8, 9-hour shift on your feet, and here are cars coming down every 45 seconds. Everybody wanted to be done with their job, whatever it was, so they could stand around and light their cigarette or drink their coffee before the next car got there. If a worker's car was scheduled to be built during his or her shift, they'd get time off to watch their car coming down the line. One of his jobs was driving cars out of the rear of one of the buildings at the plant. So he'd take a brand new factory fresh GTO, never driven by a human being, hammer it down from the plant's back end to the front, half-mile of private blacktop, no Pontiac police, no Michigan State Police. He had a blast. The combined efforts of so many led to this extraordinary success. These muscle cars were sometimes called the Great One or the GOAT as a play on the GTO acronym. 1969, DeLorean had a very high-performance GTO model developed, nicknamed the Judge, which you see on the left in that red vehicle. A takeoff on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In's comedy bit, Here Comes the Judge, seen on the right with Sammy Davis Jr. I read someplace that DeLorean liked Laugh-In, so I suppose that seems totally plausible. Anyhow, of course, Pontiac's competitors weren't sitting still. They see the success of muscle cars and they want to come out with their own. A man named Jack Smith was a Plymouth manager during the 60s. He helped launch the Roadrunner in 1968, and you can see an ad on the right, including its name. Plymouth also had a product analyst named Gordon Cherry. He used to watch Roadrunner cartoons Saturday morning with his kids, and he had the idea to use the bird image in their advertising. Chrysler management approved. Smith secured the rights to use the Roadrunner character from Warner Brothers for $50,000. Another $10,000 was spent creating the Plymouth car horn that goes beep, beep. And you can see Wile E. Coyote here. You can see what I did on Saturday mornings. You can't have Roadrunner without Coyote, so here they both are. Challenges were emerging in addition to the competition. Auto insurance companies wised up quickly, realizing the increased hazard of high-performance cars, so naturally, as you would expect, insurance premiums went up. By 1969, some insurers were charging $1,000 a year for auto insurance for a GTO for what was then a $3,600 car, so the economics are not very good. Gas prices kept going up, so these were something of a gas guzzler, so their appeal went down. Environmental rules on auto emissions and the resulting no-lead gas led to diminished engine performance. Sales began declining. They moved fewer than 11,000 cars in 1971. So the last GTOs were manufactured in 74 at Willow Run Assembly in Ypsilanti, and they were planned out in Van Nuys, California. I asked around, because I belong to the Pontiac GTO Facebook page. No one knew or could remember of a ceremony for the last GTO coming off the line here at Willow Run, which is a shame because it would have been nice. If John DeLorean did nothing else in his life except the GTO, that would be a fantastic automotive legacy. He could have gone and played golf, went skiing, or got a boat, anything. He was involved in many other projects. He decided he wanted to build a sports car in the 60s, something that would be a lifetime obsession. So in direct contravention of GM corporate policy, which made Corvettes untouchable, DeLorean ordered the development of a sports car prototype dubbed the XP833, or Experimental Pontiac. Proposed name was Banshee. Many believe it was inspired by an earlier Corvair Monza GT design. 2 of these were built. GM would never let them build one for production. It also led other projects at Pontiac, such as adopting the Camaro, which was Chevy's response to the Ford Mustang and to the Pontiac Firebird. Earlier Firebirds were better received generally than the early Camaros. DeLorean insisted on an improved car with bigger tires, lower to the ground, and bigger engines. Specially packaged, which you can see on the left, the Trans Am was launched in 1969. Those were successful. Another DeLorean success, the 1969 Grand Prix. 68 miles were converted to a smaller chassis and a longer hood. Sales increased from 32,000 to 112,000 units. Jim Wangers thought that was John DeLorean's concept, capturing the spirit and essence of the 1930s Duesenbergs. Pontiac's overhead Cam6 engine, a DeLorean creation, was used in vehicles such as the Tempest. In the view of OHC6.com, this was the most sophisticated engine ever produced by General Motors. It was lighter and more powerful than similar-sized engines. DeLorean had patents for power steering, door mounts, engine components, and upgrades such as concealed windshield wipers and Endura bumpers, hard plastic on a metal base, giving designers more options for designer and colors. Bunky Knudsen described him as a fantastic product man and a marketing analyst and one of the best engineers I know. So pretty good praise. He was named to the top job at Pontiac in 1965, becoming the youngest division head at General Motors, making more than $200,000 a year. And it was at this juncture, it seems like his persona began changing, and not necessarily for the better. Newsweek reported, excuse me, he gradually transformed himself from a button-down conformist to a vain middle-aged clothes horse. Loses 60 pounds. Began lifting weights and started wearing turtlenecks and tight-fitting suits. Dyed his hair and he had facial work done. Had this chin implant, and it just didn't look very good. The public story was he was in a car accident, and that was the result, but I'm not buying that for a second. He's out golfing in California in 1969, summoned for a phone call and told he was named Chevy's general manager, which is a big, important job at the car company. Once at Chevy, he dove into all aspects of the business, and his priority was to increase Chevy's declining market share. Provided more freedom of action for vehicle engineering and styling. He inherited the Chevy Vega program and its numerous problems, hired additional quality inspectors, and added a computerized control system saying that the Vega is going to be built at a quality level that has never been attained before in a manufacturing operation in this country. That failed. There were many underlying issues with the car design. Labor relations at Lordstown, Ohio, where Vega was assembled, were not very good, so that was part of the problem, so it was a complex issue. Vegas were named Motor Trend's Car of the Year in 1971. Vegas had many recalls, declining sales, and they were discontinued in the 1970s. Notwithstanding those problems, Chevy became the first automotive nameplate to sell more than 3 million vehicles in a single year, that being 1972. It was a major milestone, and in October that year, DeLorean was promoted to Group Vice President in charge of GM's entire car and truck business, a potential stepping stone to Chevy's presidency, and this is their old headquarters out in West Grand Boulevard in Detroit. Many at GM were getting concerned about his lifestyle, as well as leaks to the media with unflattering information about the company that may have been provided by none other than John DeLorean. He was preparing to give a speech in November 1972 to a gathering of GM's top managers at Greenbrier, West Virginia. The goal of these meetings was to have managers talk candidly about needed internal changes and new perspectives. DeLorean was asked to speak about product quality. His earlier drafts were very critical of the company and management, so management tones it down. DeLorean did go on to say that GM was spending an estimated $500 million a year in warranty repairs, a huge sum of money in the early 70s. He wrote, "Poor quality threatens to destroy us. Every defect, every recall only diminishes the credibility of whatever advertising we do. None of this was intended to the public, but wouldn't you know it, a copy showed up in the Detroit News in November 1972 because somebody leaked it, and a lot of people at General Motors thought the leaker was John DeLorean. As you would expect, GM's management was very unhappy with the leak and with him, and they disputed what DeLorean said, but too bad, too late, damage was done. Meanwhile, in addition to episodes such as Greenbrier, his personal life was unhelpful. This is his first wife here, who he married in 1954. Her name was Elizabeth Higgins. They got divorced in 1968. One of her contributions to the company was the color Verduro green as a Pontiac color option. She sees a green ashtray at a party, loved the color, borrows the ashtray, gives it to John, and says, "Why don't you make a paint scheme that looks like this?" So he gives it to Pittsburgh Paint, and sure enough, they came out with it, and I think it looks pretty good. Anyhow, they got divorced, and he then marries Kelly Harmon, who was the daughter of University of Michigan football star and Heisman Trophy winner Tom Harmon. This happened in 1969. She was 21, and he was 23 years older. And what I read it one place, didn't see it anyplace else, but they started dating when she was 19, and then GM supposedly lied about her age because it wouldn't do to have a GM executive dating a teenager. Kind of a bad look. So that marriage, whatever the backstory, lasted until 1973. Plays a swinger for a while, then he marries actress and model Christina Ferrar, who's 25 years younger than he is, after his second divorce. John DeLorean resigned from GM on May 31st, 1973. The exact details of his departure have never been disclosed. He may have been fired. He may have quit, could have been mutual agreement. I'm sure they signed some non-disclosure agreement and not publicly known, at least I've ever seen. The drama had just begun. Published in 1979, on a clear day you can see General Motors was an unauthorized bio by Patrick Wright. Had a lot of input from DeLorean, but then an issue in getting it published. The book paints a heroic picture of DeLorean and sells old scores with lots of others in GM senior management. Not much, if anything, in the way of DeLorean admitting to any personal weaknesses or failures. After leaving General Motors, he founded the DeLorean Motor Company in 1975. Financing was provided by the British government and high-profile investors such as Sammy Davis Jr. on the right and Johnny Carson on the left. Originally headquartered in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, in the 1970s, Bill Collins, the same guy who worked in the GTO, came up, designed and built the original DMC-12 prototype. Collins was unhappy with the direction of DMC and the future role in the company, he soon left. Manufacturing operations were in Dunmurry, Northern Ireland, near Belfast. It's one of the first times in North Ireland history of having Protestants and Catholics working together under the same roof. The car was designed to be a high-performance two-seat sports car, but it never lived up to its hype. They were expensive. They cost more than the era's Corvettes. Workmanship was poor. Sometimes you get locked in because the gull-wing doors wouldn't open up, and very uninspired road performance. So the British government invests $120 million in the plant. DeLorean starts making noise about moving everything to Puerto Rico, including the 2,600 jobs that were there. So the British government kicks in another $33 million. 9,000 of these cars are produced, and then Margaret Thatcher is elected Prime Minister of Britain. She and her people had enough. They cut the funding. DeLorean's, this car company is one of the most plausible efforts at a new car company since Kaiser Frazer. It failed. But I go like this ad from the Cuddy Sark ad. You can see at the top, 1 out of every 100 new businesses succeed. Here are those that take the odds. So it was a nice ad, although he failed, so there's no getting around that. Anyhow, life starts sliding backwards. Adding to his problems was his 1982 arrest for drug trafficking. According to a government sting operation, he was planning to use ill-begotten funds from a cocaine sale to support his car company. He was jailed for 10 days. He said he met a guard who was studying to be a missionary, and he begins attending Bible study classes and becomes a born-again Christian. It's not up to me to question the man's sincerity in this jailhouse conversion. I'll leave that to you. The defense's case was based on DeLorean having made bad decisions to save his founder and company by smuggling drugs. He only agreed to the scheme after government agents enticed him into the crime, and after a highly publicized trial, he was acquitted in 1984. Jurors thought DeLorean was entrapped and thus no beyond a reasonable doubt. So he's not done with the legal system. He was then charged with tax evasion and loan fraud to the tune of $8.5 million, ultimately acquitted of all charges in federal court in 1986. There was, as a side note, there was an arrest warrant out for him in Great Britain until the day he died. So he never flew back to London because he would have been hauled off to the Hooskow. Anyhow, the defense, to get him off from the tax evasion charges and the loan fraud, argued that the funds were loans from an investor who by this time had conveniently died. I'm not saying DeLorean did it, but the timing was fortuitous. The legal fees bankrupted him. He had a big estate up in New Jersey that was sold and ultimately developed by a future president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, into the Trump National Golf Course. And I think Trump's old house is the clubhouse. In his final years, Christina Ferrar and he got divorced in 1985. Presumably she had had enough of his nonsense. Married somebody named Sally Baldwin in 2002. She maintained a low profile. Never have been able to find a picture of Miss Baldwin. Passed away in 2005 at age 80, and he's buried in Troy. His obituary in the New York Times read, in his casket, he was dressed in a black motorcycle jacket, blue jeans, and a denim shirt. A pair of shades was tucked in the zipper. So you can see a pretty modest grave marker, but as we'll see, his impact was enormous. The GTO alone had an outsized influence on the automotive world. Auto writer Davis noted in 1975 that driving a GTO felt like losing your virginity, going into combat, and having your first beer in about 7 seconds. Late Paul Ingrassia wrote in his book Engines of Change about GTOs being one of the 15 most impactful cars in U.S. auto history in terms of its societal influence. By the way, it's an excellent book. Ingrassia passed away a few years ago from cancer, but it's in the library. Most libraries may or may not be here in Livonia, but it's worth reading. This vehicle may be one of the most valuable GTOs anywhere on the planet. It's finished in Orbit Orange. It looks kind of yellow there in the photograph, but it's orange. It was one of 7 1970 Judge convertibles with a special high-performance engine and automatic transmission package. One of these bad boys sold for $1.1 million in 2023. Name of the buyer doesn't seem to be publicly available. Be assured it wasn't me. It is well outside my price range. Pontiac tried to resurrect the GTO name in 2004. They took an Australian-built Holden Monaro and rebadged it as a GTO. Prospective buyers weren't impressed. Styling cues such as hood scoops, dual exhaust pipes, stacked headlights weren't present even though it was a high-performance car. The last Pontiac of any type was produced in 2010, done in by the recession of 08 and 09 and General Motors bankruptcy. Pontiacs have been in the movies, such as 1971's French Connection, featuring a Pontiac Le Mans versus an elevated train in Brooklyn. This was a shot from Smokey and the Bandit with Burt Reynolds, Jackie Gleason, Sally Fields, and a Pontiac Trans Am. You'd have to think John DeLorean would be pleased with both of these movies. 1985's Back to the Future featured a DMC-12 as a time travel machine. Filmmakers originally wanted a refrigerator, then they thought about a pickup truck, and they decided to make something futuristic looking. Thus, the DeLorean returns, providing a measure of redemption for the car and John DeLorean. You can see Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd here. 2019, the movie Framing John DeLorean came out with Alec Baldwin as DeLorean. DeLorean led the kind of life no one would believe in a fictional character. The highs were too high, the lows were too low. How do you make up such a story? Baldwin said as he was preparing for the role, Every day I think about who DeLorean is, and I have a different answer. Part of the film highlighted the toll DeLorean's problems took on his family. His daughter, Catherine, talked about the shame and embarrassment, her parents' divorce, losing everything, jokes about cocaine. For a teenage kid, this could not have been a good time period. She went to counseling to deal with all this, and she ultimately reconciles with her dad. He declared bankruptcy in '99, and he was living in a one-bedroom apartment. She boosted his spirits by introducing him to DeLorean car conventions where he could speak to people who loved his cars. DeLorean touched so many people in his life. Here's an aftermath of a few of them. Bunkie Knudsen was hired by Henry Ford II in 1968 to become president of Ford Motor. His feelings were bruised when he was passed over for GM's presidency in favor of Ed Cole. Knudsen tried to get DeLorean to come to Ford, but that failed, and then Knudsen himself was soon fired. But John DeLorean at Ford, who knows? It's impossible to know. Bunkie passed away in 1998. Engineer Bill Collins died in 2023. He was 91. He was a community hero up in Northport, Michigan. He was involved in all manner of civic improvement projects. Elizabeth Higgins DeLorean, his first wife, passed away in 2004. She appears to have stayed out of the public limelight, a pretty prudent strategy. If I were her, I'd do the same thing. She never remarried. Kelly Hartman did resurface. Appeared in TV shows such as Switch, Bay City Blues, and The Incredible Hulk. She remarried in 1984 and did ads for WRIF radio station, the rock station here back in the day. Christina Ferrar co-hosted programs such as AM Los Angeles, which for a time was a top-rated morning show in Los Angeles. Auto worker Carl Papke passed away in 2020. After he left Pontiac, he ended up working at DTE. Interviewed in 1991, he talked about owning 5 GTOs, saying, "He never lost my love for these cars. It never left. It never wavered. Never quit looking at Auto Swapper, looking for the dirt cheap 64 that I could afford to buy." And Mr. Papke is not the only one who thinks along those lines. As for the assembly plant itself, the last car at the plant rolled down the line in 1987. The complex has been demolished, and now some of it's a post office distribution center. A local love story had a helping hand from John DeLorean. On the top left are teenagers Dave and Patty, who grew up in the 60s in Metro Detroit. They rode around in Dave's 66 GTO. They were each other's first boyfriend and girlfriend, and like I said, I assume that's their high school shots. So Patty's family moves away, and that's the end of the romance until 50 years later, she finds Dave on Facebook. Next thing you know, they got married. What happened to their prior spouses is unknown, none of my business, I'm sure, but they're married. So they go out and buy a 66 GTO, drove it in the 2018 Dream Cruise, and they were profiled on Detroit's Channel 7, which is how I found the story. And the Dream Cruise started as a small fundraiser to raise money for a soccer field in Ferndale. Now draws over 1 million people a year and 40,000 classic cars each year. Many of those cars are GTOs or cars inspired by the GTO, so you know the John DeLorean legacy. There is a dedicated group of GTO restorers, but tread carefully if you're interested. You will need a lot of money. This from a GTO Facebook page. Some say a restoration of a car is a bankruptcy starter kit. Total rebuild might be at $50,000 before you bat an eye, and that doesn't include the cost of the car, and that's if you do most of the work yourself. Repainting it might be another $25,000, depending on how much sheet metal you need. Do it yourself if you're really dedicated and got time in your hands, 3 years, give or take. Or it can sit in the garage, get rusty, you get sick of it, and then you have a fire sale just to get the thing out of your garage. If you're so inclined, there are specialty stores in the area that sell already restored cars. A fully restored GTO might be $110,000 on up. Easy payments of $1,000 a month for some God knows how many years. So good luck. Unknown in the future, there is a DeLorean Reimagined LLC that has an Alpha 5 sedan concept. Estimated price is $145,000, potentially on sale this year. You can reserve one if you're so inclined. Goal of his nephew, Paul DeLorean, who's CEO and chief designer of DeLorean Aerospace, is to develop a flying car. Seems unlikely, but stranger things have happened. His daughter, Catherine, shown here on the right, has a vision called the DeLorean Next Gen Motors. It's to be based in Detroit, and that's a prototype of what a model might look like. If it becomes reality or not, I don't know, but I wish her well. So how do you assess this man's life? As for the cars, Paul Ingrassi, the auto writer, attended a GTO rally about 15 years ago, and he wrote that these rallies, that the GTOs are like potent elixirs that vividly evoke the flat-bellied, full-haired, testosterone-driven days of their past, for all the guys bringing in their GTOs. As for John personally, one of his attorneys said, DeLorean had one of the most warped views of right and wrong he had ever come across. In a better light, Jim Wangers commented, DeLorean was a complete car guy, the best general manager any GM division ever had. Auto journalist Paul Zazarine wrote, DeLorean energized Pontiac with his youth, his leadership, and his vision, regardless of his faults and how his genius was dashed in scandal and corruptions. GM, as you all know, had its struggles in the latter part of the 20th and 21st century. We just wonder, suppose DeLorean was able to curb his excesses and his appetites and focus on what he did at Pontiac for General Motors as a whole, which is to lead the charge for new and exciting cars. How would that have played out for GM? I don't know. Thank you for your time. I've got a short tape of an ad featuring a GTO and actor Paul Richards, and I might see if I can get a little technical assistance bring it. It's a 1-minute spot from '67. So it's, yep.
This is the great one, the ultimate driving machine. And if you don't know what that means, you're excused. But if when you see this car, you're seized with an uncontrollable urge to plant yourself behind the wheel and head for the wide open spaces, then we're talking to you. The great one is an idea on wheels. The idea that there's more to driving than just moving from place to place in isolated indifference. The great one is 400 cubic inches of glistening engine. The great one is a superb road handling chassis. The great one is bucket seats, carpeting, and a walnut-style instrument panel. The great one is Pontiac GTO for 1967. Isn't it time you decided to ride the wide track winning streak? The great one is here.
Super ad. Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.